Today is Monday, September 29th, 2014. The purpose of this video is to document the Kenilworth corridor as it is prior to the construction of the Southwest LRT. The Cedar Lake Park Association has taken it upon itself to document this as part of its preservation effort in preserving parks and trails around Cedar Lake. We are now heading south on the Kenilworth corridor. It's about 7 o'clock in the evening, and it is autumn, as you perhaps can tell. The area that we are heading through at this time used to be a part of the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad shops and yards until about 1986. Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad inhabited this area from about 1871 until it was taken over by the Northwestern Chicago in 1970 or so. The shops and yards, which at one time there were more than 19 major buildings and a number of minor buildings, were razed in 1986 when the corridor was purchased by Hennepin County for use as for possible use as a future light rail corridor. We're coming up to a place where the corridor narrows as we cross 21st Street. This is a very historic part of the Kenilworth corridor. Just to your left, probably past where the road is now, used to sit the Kenwood Depot, which was a commuter depot at its inception in 1886. That only lasted for about 8 years as other forms of transportation supplanted commuter rail as the way to get into the city. At this time, we are now entering what was at one time the East Bay of Cedar Lake. It's hard to believe, but as you can see by the flatness, this all used to be part of a very shallow bay. In 1867, the first railroad to come through here built an earthen causeway to run the rails over. From that time on, for the decades to come, the sides on both sides of the causeway were filled in by cinder and other earthen debris until the entire east side of the causeway was filled in. Later, between 1911 and 1913, actually in July, I think, or August of 1913, Cedar Lake was lowered by 5 feet, and the lake bay dried up. This is the Kenilworth Canal, which artificially connects, as I guess most canals do, Lake of the Isles and Cedar Lake. That was built in stages between 1911 and 1913, and then in, I believe, August of 1913, the temporary dam was opened. The water poured out of Cedar Lake, 5 feet of it, to lower the lake and significantly transform the land. Now we're coming up to Cedar Lake Parkway, a very busy through street, actually a major road through this area, mostly because of the lakes that surround us. The corridor itself, the Kenilworth Trail, runs about 1.5 miles, maybe a little bit less, but it's a vital north-south connector connecting the Midtown Greenway and the Cedar Lake Regional Trail. We actually started at the northern terminus of the Kenilworth corridor and will now be ending, or actually turning around, at the southern terminus. As you can see, to the right of me, to the west, there is still an active freight line that runs through here. The freight rail has been a source of much contention. This is a very tight spot here, and many people wonder how the freight rail, 2 light rail lines, and anything resembling a safe Kenilworth Trail can exist. We certainly hope that that will be the case. And we're coming up to the end of the Kenilworth corridor as it tees to the Midtown Greenway. To the west, where we're looking now, is Hopkins, St. Louis Park, various other places. Fortunately, I sort of have to walk and chew gum at the same time here. And as we just swung around, you can see to the east, the Midtown Greenway goes into Minneapolis. We are, at this time, in Minneapolis. We're about 1/4 mile away from the line between Minneapolis and St. Louis Park. Now we're heading north on the trail. Again, you can see the extreme pinch point here, where the townhouses on the west side and the old converted grain elevator on the right side or east side make it a very difficult place to run all of the rails and trails that are going to make up the Southwest LRT. One of the reasons why we're doing this now is that it's quite possible that the LRT construction may begin as early as spring of next year, and we want to make sure and get a before look at the corridor. Corridor is a very busy place. Lots of families with children, families riding bicycles, and certainly safety is one of the issues that we're concerned about. Um, Thank you. The people of Minneapolis and the surrounding area are often very polite when it comes to letting bicyclists cross the trail. However, it is a dangerous place, and certainly Cedar Lake Park Association hopes that in the future we may see some improvements there at a place that Theodore Wirth himself called one of the most dangerous spots in the Twin Cities. Coming back up to the Kenilworth corridor, this bridge which is an old bridge, the superstructure has been was redone about 15 years ago when the trail was put in. I believe the trail was put in 2000, somewhere around there. The first trail to come through this area was the Cedar Lake Regional Trail, which was built in 1995, and then the Midtown Greenway and the Kenilworth were built a few years later, forming an incredible nexus, if you will, of transportation that will allow a bicyclist to ride for miles and miles, perhaps up to 100 miles, certainly 50 or 60, 70 miles, without having to go on to a major street or any street whatsoever, though you do have to cross some streets. Again, we're back out in the East Bay. To the left, you can see trees and perhaps even get a glimpse of hills that block the view to Cedar Lake itself. Those hills are actually garbage dump. In the 1950s and 1960s, Minneapolis dumped much of the road construction that was going on the east side of the lake, and I'm not sure whether or not they actually covered it or nature covered it, as often happens. Trees sprung up, especially cottonwood trees, which can grow to pretty impressive heights very quickly. So the trees there that are quite high are probably no more than 60 years old, which is actually a fairly good term. Just past the 21st Street again, and are now heading north. Again, the area opens up. Once there were bluffs on each side of the corridor here, but during the latter part of the 19th century, the railroad, in particular the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad, used the bluffs to fill up the lake and to make more flat land for them to build rails on. It may sound like I'm speaking badly of the railroad for doing this. One could make the case that they were destroying nature to build what Professor William Cronin calls second nature, a human overlay on the land. I have often argued that until someone kind of caught me up short, and I realized, because someone said, well, what would it take to bring it back to what it was? And I sort of mumbled the response, but I realized I wouldn't want to, because where those rail corridors were are now beautiful bicycle trails. And this is one of the most beautiful bicycle trails in the nation. It is certainly hoped by the Cedar Lake Park Association that this will help those planners and those that come after to, if not restore, at least get an aesthetic view of what the corridor was like, how much it was used, how much people loved it, and rebuild the trail with that aesthetic in mind. We're now really coming up to the end of the Kenilworth corridor. You can see the signs to the left of me. Although it looks like the corridor goes on, this actually is the terminus right here, and we now pick up here the Cedar Lake Regional Trail as it goes into the Mississippi River. It goes into downtown Minneapolis and into the Mississippi River. The Cedar Lake Regional Trail has its own history. The north side of the lake was also a railroad yard, a very massive yard. So this area right here was where the Minneapolis and St. Louis tracks and the, I always call it Hills Railroad, if you want to call it the Great Northern or the Burlington Northern or the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. It still is the legacy of the great James J. Hill, who was one of the most, it is the most famous robber baron of the Twin Cities. His base was in St. Paul, and part of what the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad was about was trying to wrest control of the grain that was coming in from the west, from Hill, from St. Paul, and from Chicago. This is the trailhead up to Kenwood. Well, we're going to turn around and get a view of the Cedar Lake Trail as we're heading west. I'm not sure how good the shot will be, as we are going to have to consider the setting sun. Quite beautiful, but I'm not sure how well it will show up on the camera. But we're going to give it a go, because I want to go out the Cedar Lake Trail. It is one of the glories of Minneapolis. I personally believe, and I've been to many places, that it is the premier trail in the United States, perhaps in the world. I know that's a boastful sound, but bear with me. I think it has attributes that make it unique, beautiful. Last week, the designer of the trail was in town, Steve Durant, and we talked about the way in which the trail undulates, as you will be able to see, so that there are times when you can just barely make out that there's anybody else around you. It's really a glorious feeling to be out in the trail system. There are 3 trails. The 2 bicycle trails are 10 feet in width, and the walking trail is, I believe, 8 feet in width. This is the northernmost trail that goes west. The middle trail is the eastern bicycle trail, and then the trail closest to the park itself, to the inner part of the park itself, is the walking trail. The park, Cedar Lake Park, was purchased, the land was purchased in 1991 after several years of negotiation with the railroad. This was all, again, a flat as a pancake rail yard. The successor to Hills Railroad, the Burlington Northern at the time, decided that it didn't need a yard here anymore. The wheat traffic had vanished. There still is an active rail line that perhaps you can see to the right of me, to the north. It still carries a lot of freight, several trains heading east and west, and with the rebirth or birth of the North Dakota frac mining, traffic has boomed all around the city. One of the things that some people find less than wonderful is that they sort of wonder, where's the lake? The trails were built on the outer edges of the park. The inner park is near the lake. The Cedar Lake Park Association believes that these trails form a wonderful circuitous route around the lake, and that we believe in what we call points of access, or nodes of access, where you could go in and visit the lake itself, fish. There actually is a lot of fishing just to the left of us. We're now coming up to the Cedar Lake Parkway Bridge. First, we have a little bridge that goes over a canal that connects Cedar Lake with Brownie Lake, which you can just see to the right. We'll come back at another time and view the plaques and the visuals that are under the bridge. We're coming up here to the edge of the city of Minneapolis. However, in 1991, when the Burlington Northern decided to sell its holdings here on the north side of the lake, it also decided that it didn't want a fairly long strip of land here that runs basically from Highway 100 to the Cedar Lake Parkway. Highway 100 in the west to the Cedar Lake Parkway in the east. So we are actually right now on land that's in St. Louis Park, but the trail is owned by the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board. The Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board is its own autonomous board entity. It has its own taxing ability or revenue stream, And it is not, this trail is not the only piece of land, park, golf course that is outside of the actual Minneapolis city limits. It is known nationwide as an extraordinary park system, and when in 1991 the Cedar Lake Park Association, who helped raise the funds to buy the land along with state and federal resources, the thought was always that